People sometimes ask me what it's like being a park ranger. I have to admit, it's a dream job for the most part. I work as a wilderness ranger, and that means I get to go it by myself with little to no supervision, wandering Yosemite National Park alone. I look for ways to restore nature to its proper state. I try to keep the park looking the way it's supposed to, pristine and beautiful, just the way it has been since long before humans were around to be disruptive. If you asked me what I was looking for, I'd be hard-pressed to say it out loud. I just know when I see it. The telltale signs of human activity, which indicate a camping party has visited an area recently. People will often rearrange logs, rocks, or a fire pit. They'll leave trash laying around, half-burnt sticks used for roasting marshmallows, and other signs of their presence scattered about. Hand-dug latrines, holes filled with cigarette butts, and all sorts of crude words and phrases carved into trees. I've seen things that make my eyes water. As a lover of nature and the untouched wilderness, my job is to correct their mistakes where possible, returning the wilderness to its natural form so that the next person to come along doesn't have to shed a tear at the sight of a forest slowly deteriorating with each subsequent visit. I think my job's vital. I'd hate to consider what this place might look like without people like me. But every once in a while, even someone as experienced as me can make a mistake, and that's exactly what happened. I made a terrible mistake, and now the wilderness I've always sought to protect has turned against me. I'm not sure if I'm going to get out of this alive. My uncle was the one who first told me about fairy rings. If you're ever walking alone through forests and you stumble across a ring of mushrooms and it looks too perfect, don't touch it, he said to me once. Those rings are made by fairies, and if you disturb them, they'll come after you. You might have bad luck, or even worse, you could fall into their world and become trapped there. Uncle Bill had worked as a park ranger in his younger days, and he had lots of great stories about working at Yosemite National Park. Maybe that was partly why I wanted to get into this line of work when I was younger. He told me and my older brother plenty of stories based in fact, but also quite a few based on folklore and legends, and some that he pulled straight out of his ass. Those were usually the best ones. It was often hard to tell the truth from fiction, at least for me. As I got older, I learned that many of the stories my Uncle Bill told me were fantastical lies, but I never held that against him. He made the world into a wild, hilarious, magical place for me from an early age. I remember he'd sing songs while playing his acoustic guitar around the campfire, making up the funniest lyrics I'd ever heard as he went along. To my young mind, it was like magic, even if he was just replacing the lyrics to Candyman with Candy Dog. To me, it was mind-blowing. Weird Al had nothing on my Uncle Bill as far as I was concerned. And I'll never forget that feeling of walking through the forest with him, marveling as he explained the subtleties of nature and believing in all the hidden things he told me about, real or not. Of course, as an adult, I didn't believe in magical things anymore. Fairy rings were not made by fairies. They were natural, although there were competing theories on how they came about. I had learned in college that it was a biological process. There's plenty of folklore around these odd-looking mushroom circles, but none of it is based in fact, or at least so I thought. But then all of that changed. Recently, I came across a ring of mushrooms in the forest. It looked too perfect and organized. In the back of my mind, I recalled the advice from my uncle, but I no longer took it seriously. I reminded myself that he'd always loved to tell me tales of magical, fantastical things. That didn't mean they were true, though. Once, when I was a small child and we were canoeing, I was getting tired and wanted to go back. He told me that if we just kept going on this particular lake, there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken just up ahead. I pretended not to believe him, but a little piece of 8-year-old me had been genuinely curious if we would find the Colonel and his secret blend of herbs and spices located on a floating restaurant dock just around the next bend. Even though I didn't believe this ring of mushrooms was made by fairies, I didn't want to disturb it. It looked surreal and beautiful, all the way out here in the middle of the forest. I just stood and admired it for several long moments. A sound came from behind me, startling me, and I spun around to see a deer in the woods just a little ways away. For some reason, I decided to take a picture of it and set my backpack down to get out my phone. I was looking down as I unzipped the bag, and when I looked back up again, I was shocked. The deer was just a few feet away now, standing right in front of me. I backed up instinctively and felt the large mushrooms crush underfoot as I did so. The deer reared up on its hind legs for a second, then turned around and disappeared into the forest again. My heart beating too fast, I looked down. The once complete circle of mushrooms was now a lazy arc with a mashed up pile of brown mush at one end. "Shit," I said out loud, looking down at the gunk on my boot heel. I scraped the mush off my shoe on a nearby rock, feeling suddenly nervous for reasons I couldn't understand. Why did I feel like I had broken some law? Like I had just grievously injured an innocent person? I hated disturbing nature in any way, hence my chosen profession. So I chalked it up to a feeling of guilt for trampling a beautiful ring of mushrooms. Looking around the forest, I tried to ignore the feeling that there were eyes watching me. Was Mother Nature silently judging me from all around? Or was that just my imagination? "Sorry, fairies," I muttered, picking up my backpack and moving on from the circle of mushrooms that was now a horseshoe and a brown splatter on one end. I started moving again and looked up to see a storm was rolling in. There wasn't one predicted, but the weather around this area could be random at times, and it wasn't the first time the meteorologists had been wrong. I figured I should start heading back toward the ranger station, so I turned around to go back the way I had come. There was no trail in this part of the forest. It was all navigated by landmarks and compass. I knew I had to head north and travel back up the slope, and eventually I'd find my way to the top of a ridge. From there, I would make my way back down toward a hiking trail. The cliffs far off to the east would serve as a constant marker. As long as I was within sight of them, I knew the park so well I could picture it all in my mind's eye. Plenty of thick forest was in my way between here and there, but it was easy enough to navigate if you knew how to keep a straight line. I started walking, picking up the pace when I heard a rumble of thunder heading my way. The storm was moving in very quickly, and a cold breeze rushed through my hair and chilled the back of my neck, as if to confirm this. After 15 minutes of walking steadily uphill, the wind was picking up even further, causing branches to come crashing down from the trees. The towering wooden columns were swaying violently all around me. It made me feel very nervous that something could fall down on me from above. Weirdly, the ground began to slope downwards. That didn't seem right, so I paused for a second to check my compass, but it was missing from its usual spot where I had attached it to my belt. Weird. It had only been there 20 minutes prior. Reaching my other hand down to feel for my radio, I noticed with increasing panic that it was gone as well. My heart began to beat a little faster as I looked through my bag and all my gear, trying to find these two crucial pieces of equipment. I never left the ranger station without either one. I continued moving in what I thought was the right direction, hoping I was just remembering the landscape wrong. Maybe there was a valley before the ground sloped upwards again? I had been mistaken before about things like this, and I usually found it was best to just go with my gut. The problem was, my gut wasn't sure anymore. I knew this was the right way, but my eyes weren't matching my sense of direction. I checked the moss on a nearby tree, and it confirmed my internal compass. Still feeling uneasy, I continued moving along, going deeper and deeper into this part of the forest, into what looked like a dark valley. As I walked, I began to see things that didn't make sense. Plants that I'd never seen before. Mushrooms in various shades and colors, ranging from greens to reds, yellows and oranges, even a few that were blue with yellow polka dots. I came upon 3 snowy white mushrooms that were so tall and broad they were as big as a child. They stood at waist height and swayed as I approached, as if aware of my presence. I'd never seen anything like them, and wondered if I'd accidentally ingested some sort of hallucinogen when I stepped on that fairy ring. Or maybe I fell into their world, Another voice in my mind said, sounding like my Uncle Bill, "No, that's impossible," I muttered to myself. "This is impossible." The clouds above were turning black with approaching rain, and that chilly breeze came again, running cold fingers through my hair. I spun around at the sound of movement behind me, terrified of what it could be. I reeled backwards, my eyes wide, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. There was no one behind me, but something was very different. The trees had moved. Several large firs were now blocking my way completely, standing next to each other in a way that did not even remotely resemble the ways in which trees grow. They were shoulder to shoulder, with no room for root growth or for light to come through. It occurred to me after several minutes that there was only one thing that could have happened. The trees were moving. They were alive, and they were surrounding me, cutting off my escape. I spun around and ducked away from the huge white swaying mushrooms as they swiveled, their huge caps turning like heads to watch me go. My legs feeling like jelly, I began to run, faster than I'd ever run before, racing through the forest, going deeper and deeper into this dark, uncanny valley. Birds called from the trees above, their songs unfamiliar and strange. I began to see flowers and other plants that seemed to be watching me as well, just like the mushrooms in the trees. And I realized the forest was keenly aware of my presence. The trees were allowing me through, making a path for me, as if this was the way they wanted me to go. I didn't know where I was running to, just that I needed to get away from those moving trees and the mushrooms that seemed to be watching me. But things were only getting stranger as I moved deeper into the forest. Finally, the ground leveled off and the trees parted completely to reveal a river inlet. Towering cliffs stood on either side of the water, going straight up more than 100 feet on both sides. There was a hollow half log of driftwood floating on the water, looking to me very much like a raft. I turned around to see the trees had closed in, blocking my exit. There was only one way to go, forward. Up above, the skies were dark and swirling, and rain began to pour down, drenching me completely. As I climbed onto the log, I let my legs hang off either side and straddled it as the river began to swell. A few seconds later, I was drifting downstream on the buoyant log. It seemed like this whole area of the forest was one giant hive mind. It was guiding me somewhere. No, it was taking me somewhere. As I drifted along the stream, the current picked up speed until it was a quickly rushing river. Rapids and whirlpools tossed me up and down and spun me around, setting the log tilting and tumbling over rocks and waterfalls. My legs scraped against stone and were cut on their sharp edges. Several times, I lost my grip in the slick wood and the rain and nearly went headlong into the rapids. The water began to calm slightly, and I looked up to see there were now caves dotting the cliffs, looking down on me from above. Black holes pockmarked their sheer vertical walls like doorways into the unenterable homes of creatures that dwelled impossibly there. There was no discernible way to get up to those dark entrances, and yet I saw multiple red glowing eyes looking out at me from each one. This forced my mind to imagine the type of creature which could dwell in such a gravity-defying abode. I imagined humanoid chameleons, giant lizardmen, scaling smooth vertical walls of granite, climbing the stone as if they had suction cups attached to their hands and feet. Shuddering at this mental image, I just hoped those creatures weren't hungry and that they wouldn't decide to come down to the river to greet me. Their glaring eyes watched me as I drifted along, and I was so distracted by them that I didn't even notice the gravel shoreline coming up. Unprepared, my momentum threw me from the log and I went tumbling into the rocky shore. I stood and looked up to see I was just outside a cave. It stood before me ominously, and I heard a strange noise coming from inside. This made me curious, and I found myself taking tentative steps into the cavern. As my eyes adjusted, I saw there were steps leading down, carved into the rock. The wet stone dripped with moisture, cold water landing on my head and my hands occasionally. It was still pouring outside. It was nice to be out of the rain, although I was still more than a little frightened. "They'll want your eye," a voice said from the shadows, causing me to jump. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Just one will suffice, but if one is better than the other, you'd better give them that one and not the other." I spun around at the sound, looking for the source. "Down here," it said, and I looked to see a small rabbit. Its eyes were red, its fur white and albino. "What did you say? How are you talking?" "You're a rabbit," I objected, as if this were the least sensible thing to happen to me today. "There's no time for this. The longer you stay, the more you're going to lose. Don't ask questions, just do as I tell you." The bunny was as insistent as it was cute. I was reminded a bit of the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. The comparison seemed very apt at this moment. I just hoped this rabbit could lead me out of here. "Oh, okay," I said. "I'll trust you." "Good," the rabbit said. "Listen closely. You've desecrated a sacred place, the fairy ring." I tried to interrupt, to say I hadn't meant to, but he shushed me and continued. "It doesn't matter if you meant to or not. That was up ahead. The ones tasked with protecting this place, you must make it up to them. And there's only one way." I thought about his first words to me. "My eyes. They want my eyes." No, just one eye. You can pick, like I said, just so long as one isn't noticeably better than the other. I tried to protest again, but he was already hopping away, his little fuzzy white tail the last thing I saw before he disappeared into the shadows. "Great," I said to myself when he was gone. "Just an eye. That's all." I made my way down the stone steps and deeper into the darkness. Fire spouted from torches up ahead, leading me toward a raised platform where figures stood waiting for me. As I got closer, I saw what they were. Giant toads, each one as large as a Volkswagen Beetle. Their eyes were strange and faceted like mosquitoes, dark and reflective as polished jewels, staring intently at me as I approached. Their glaring eyes lacked any emotion. It was like a panel of judges, I realized, as I marched into the midst of them. They looked at me coldly for several long minutes until I wondered if they were waiting for me to do something. "They'll want your eye," I remembered the rabbit saying. That was insane. I wasn't going to give these monsters my eye. For what? Stepping on a few mushrooms? I scoffed at them and turned around to leave, but found myself face to face with cold, wet stone. The cave had shrunk, and it was now only this small room, just barely big enough for me and these 5 enormous toads. They stared at me with blank eyes. "What do you want from me?" I asked, raising my voice to ask them again. When they didn't respond, finally one of them did something different. It glanced down at the cold stone floor of the cavern. I followed its gaze to see a sharp rock, like a broken piece of graphite. I found myself reaching down to pick it up. "No, I can't," I said. But the longer we stood there, the more it became apparent that I would have to. The stink of the toads and the damp chill of the cave was becoming oppressive. If I wanted to leave, I would need to do what the rabbit said. Somehow he had known, as if this was the way it was meant to be. Time passed. I debated and pleaded with them. I got down on my knees and cried, but they never blinked an eye. Finally, after what felt like hours inside that cave, I decided I had to do it. I realized there was no other way. My heart pounding with terror, I lifted the sharp stone to my left eye and watched as the toads began to nod their oversized heads, their wide mouths stretching into even wider grins. I dug the point of the stone into my eye socket and began to pry and twist, thrusting it deeper until my vision clouded with darkness and red. The pain was so bad I had to stop several times. My knees buckled as I almost passed out from the agony. Slippery gore made it difficult to find purchase. But after several attempts, I finally managed to leverage the eyeball from its socket. Twisting and digging, it came out the rest of the way and fell, dangling from the tendon like a tether, swaying and spinning as it hung from my ruined face. One of the toads snapped out its tongue and grabbed hold of the eye, yanking it backward toward itself and tearing the tendon in half in the process. The pain of that was terrible, somehow worse than anything yet. Gasping for breath, I dropped the blood-slick stone to the floor of the cavern, bending over at the waist, trying to keep my lunch down. I felt queasy and sick about what I had just done, a terrible feeling blowing up inside of me that I was now broken, that I had just lost some essential part of myself, like when you lose an adult tooth or sever a finger with a table saw. I was not going to get that eye back. It was gone forever, and was now being digested in the belly of a great mythological toad. I blinked my one remaining eye, and when I opened it again, I was standing back in the forest with my boot in a puddle of squashed mushrooms. The fairy ring. I was standing half inside and half outside of it. I took my foot out of the circle, feeling the warmth of blood running down my face from my missing eye. Looking up at the sky, I saw it was clear and blue, with no indication of the storm I had witnessed earlier. There were no more dark clouds, no more crashes of thunder. It was as if the whole thing had been a daydream, if not for the fact that I was missing my eye. I had no doubt that it was necessary for me to leave that place. If I hadn't done what I did, that other world would not have let me go. If not for the rabbit and his advice, I never would have escaped. I made my way back to the ranger station. This time, the hill sloped upward the whole way, just as expected. At the top, there was a ridge with cliffs in the distance, guiding my way back home. When I got back to the ranger station, there was only one little problem. My boss acted like I didn't exist. At first, I thought he was upset with me for some reason. I tried to talk to him calmly, but eventually resorted to yelling and screaming in his face. Nothing I did seemed to make a difference. It's like I was invisible to him. My other coworkers, my friends, and my family, none of them could see me anymore either. I've gone to see everyone I know, and they all act like I'm a ghost. Like I never even existed. My landlord moved my things out of my apartment, put new locks on the door. Ever since that trip to the fairy world, or whatever that place was, I'm invisible to everyone. I'm a ghost. I can still use my phone, at least until it gets shut off for non-payment. So I've been doing some research on fairy rings in particular. From what I've learned, there are lots of legends and myths surrounding them. But one caught my attention. Some say that if you wander into a fairy ring, you'll be transported to another world, and that you can only escape by giving up an eye to the guardians of that world. The guardians look like giant toads with the eyes of insects. Other legends say that if you wander into a fairy ring, the magical creatures of the forest will trap you there, or make you disappear so that no one can ever see you again. I think somehow I got the worst of both curses. I'm scared that this may never wear off. Whatever the spell is, it may be permanent. They'll want your eye, the rabbit had told me. Just one will suffice, but if one is better than the other, you'd best give them that one and not the other. My left eye has always been a little worse. I was so used to it, I'd forgotten. It completely slipped my mind that my contact lens prescription was just a little bit stronger on that side. I wonder if somehow the toads knew. I'm going back out to the forest to try to make another deal with them. I'll give them anything, even if it's my other eye. I'd rather be blind than invisible. You have no idea what this is like. It's worse than death. I just hope I can find my way back to the fairy world, and then back out of the forest again. I'm leaving now, after typing this out. If you don't hear from me, you'll know where I am. I have a funny feeling I'll be missing both eyes pretty soon. But I'm okay with it. I have peace with nature, and nature has a piece of me. A man once paid me to be hunted for sport. I had stumbled across his post when I was browsing the web for work. I was looking for some sort of side gig to pass the time. I was at a bit of a crossroads in my life. I had quit my previous job to break away from the redundancy it had sucked me into. It was a spontaneous decision with no real-life planning. Luckily, in this day and age, the internet caters to people like me. People who don't care about chasing money or don't want to be tied down. It wasn't the money I was after, but the change it would provide. I felt like I couldn't enjoy anything in life, like I was just going through the motions. That night, I had been scrolling for quite some time, skimming over job posts, help wanted here, shorthanded there. I didn't think I would find anything that would suit me. It all seemed like the same thing disguised under a different title. That was until I found this particular ad. I thought it was a scam at first. Comical dollar signs on each side of the Craigslist title, like a trap set for the elderly in search of credit card numbers. I clicked on it anyway, curiosity getting the better of me. In all caps, the posting read, "Big money for manhunt volunteers." At least it was to the point. The details below gave a brief introduction as to what the job entailed. I skimmed them over with amusement, half of me doubting if it was true, the other half kind of hoping it was. As ridiculous as the prospect was, I had to admit it was exciting. There were some requirements for the job, however, and I was surprised to find that I fit the bill. Must be male. Must be young and fit if possible. Must not be afraid of the dark. Must come alone. No cell phones, no firearms, no police. Must meet the night before to discuss further. The list went on for a while, but ultimately ended with a phone number and a typed signature from someone simply named Bob. I found myself thinking it over. I didn't exactly have anything to lose, no family or friends. I always lived alone. The idea of wanting to pack up at a moment's notice never seemed to sit well with any of the significant others I had in the past. I don't know if it was stupidity or the need for adventure, but in the end, I found myself grabbing my phone. I mean, how often do people get to say they were hunted for sport? The money wouldn't hurt either. I gave him a ring. The man who answered the call was tipsy but eager, and when I mentioned my interest in his post, he seemed to be ecstatic, like I was calling to give him the lead role in a movie. The conversation was a little awkward considering the reasoning behind the call itself, but after a few minutes of cryptic back and forth, we agreed on a meeting place. I was a few towns away, but he insisted I meet him closer to his side of the woods. The hunt would be at his estate, and I should stay in town so I was well rested for the event. We would meet at a local bar called the Sixth Shot to discuss terms and conditions. He seemed determined, like he had been waiting for someone for a while. He said he would understand if I was in no hurry, but with my current status of unemployment and lack of overall plans, I found myself meeting his energy. I had to admit the concept was a little exciting, if it was real at all. We decided to meet the next day. The Sixth Shot was a bustling little place. A neon sign with a smoking gun made it easy to find. When I arrived, I found the guy immediately. He looked about how you'd expect a manhunter to look. He pulled it off well. A black polo and tan cargos, a shiny shaved head with a thick curled mustache, all worn on a very tan and muscular body. He was sitting at the bar alone, and he lit up like a Christmas tree when he saw me. Like he knew. He patted the stool next to him like he was welcoming a long-lost friend. When I crossed the bar, I was met with a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder. He told me he was delighted to meet me, and drinks were on him. After a brief introduction, he got a glass of top-shelf bourbon for himself, while I sipped on an Irish red ale. I had acquired a taste for it recently. Considering he was trying to hire me with the intent to murder me, he sounded like a pretty cool guy. We got to know each other a little before getting to the serious stuff. The people around, enjoying their drinks, were none the wiser. The man known as Bob was actually Robert Callahan, a man born into a world of wealth and, as it seemed, perpetual boredom. His father ran a very successful chain of automotive stamping companies that he inherited from his grandfather. By the time his father passed, there were so many buildings and people assigned to making the gears turn efficiently across the globe without his input. He was able to live a life of leisure on a 7-figure income without as much as lifting a finger. The companies ran themselves as he got older, and he filled his adult years with seeking thrills across the globe. He tried anything that got his adrenaline pumping, from skydiving to whitewater rafting. He took a liking to hunting, which he said had started an escapade of finding the world's most dangerous predators and killing them, no matter the cost. He said he had seen it all, but in all his years, there was one thing he hadn't bagged: a human. I laughed at his extraordinary lifestyle, feeling a bit mundane when it was my turn to share stories. Mine was far from exciting. I left the more boring bits out, but I told him I spent most of my 20s as a park ranger. It kept me close to nature and the outdoors, but when it's all you look at, it tends to lose its luster. I left that to be a cab driver in a big city, something that kept me in transit and entertained for a while. Always moving, with so many people to observe in the busy city life. But in time, I found myself too contained to the city itself, which is why I recently quit. This brings me to about where I was right now, discussing being hunted by another man. He was fascinated, jotting down notes in a little pocketbook while he sipped his bourbon. We conversed for a time. I finished a couple of beers, and he ordered another pour of bourbon. The conversation was nice. It had been a while since the last time I went out with friends. Despite the fun I was having, we couldn't beat around the bush forever. When it came time to discuss the actual terms of our agreement, his face turned serious. I would be paid $5,000 tonight. Granted, I still wanted to go through with it. He said this would help me settle accounts before the event. He said he owned a mansion outside of town with over 30 acres of forest land. He was outside city limits. His nearest neighbor was 6 miles away. No one would hear screams or gunshots. We would start tomorrow night. I was supposed to get to his estate at 10 p.m. After my arrival, I would get 15 minutes to head into the forest as a head start. He explained when the 15 minutes were up, he would promptly signal with a flare. If I had any second thoughts, I needed to address them and withdraw from the woods before the signal. If I was still in the woods when the flare went off, I would be shot on sight. He said I would be paid $10,000 an hour if I survived. The hunt would go on until dawn, and if I was still alive come daybreak, I would be free. He would be armed with a hunting rifle and a combat knife. I would be armed with my wits. It was evident it wasn't in his plans for me to survive. But that was something I had already come to terms with. He studied my face when he said these things, perhaps trying to gauge my reaction. I tried my best to play it cool, despite being a little nervous. "Does any of this bother you?" he eventually asked, downing the last of his drink. "No, not really. I've always just tried to go with the flow. Doing that made me stumble upon your offer. Maybe if I get out and live a little, it'll encourage me to settle down for a bit more. That is, if I make it out alive." I winked, and we both had a laugh. "You're a riot. If I wasn't trying to kill you, I think we'd be pretty good friends." After all the details were ironed out, he paid the tab, and it was time for us to take our leave. We shook on it before going our separate ways. He was excited for the next day, a pep in his step carrying him to his obnoxiously lifted truck. He burned out as he left, almost rear-ending a Buick as he left the parking lot. I watched him go, feeling oddly serene in the cool night air. It was hard to describe. There was no one waiting for me to come back, no one to give me a courtesy call if I didn't show up. I didn't know if it was the thrill of the challenge or the drastic break in monotony. I spent my life trying not to be a creature of habit. Maybe this would be the last shift off course, or maybe tomorrow I would die and not have to worry about it anymore. With the moon shining bright and the cool breeze on my neck, I decided I would take a walk before sleeping in my car for the night. It might be my last time to enjoy a night like this. The next day, I woke in the backseat of my car, feeling oddly rejuvenated despite my choice of bed for the night. Through the blinding afternoon rays, I found my phone and checked my bank account. He was a man of his word. The $5,000 had been wired as promised. I decided I would go into town, indulge in some of the local variety, and find a place to shower before meeting Robert at the estate. I climbed into the front seat and left the parking lot on my way into town. I called my landlord and canceled my lease. I was already living in and out of boxes, and my lease was month to month, so I wouldn't exactly be missed. After getting something to eat, I called and canceled all my utility accounts, electricity, internet, stuff like that. I had already put in my resignation at the cab company. There wasn't really any ties to my life at my apartment. I would either survive till dawn and get the biggest payday of my life, or not have to worry about the next step if I failed. Either way, this was the end of the current chapter of my life. After spending the day driving around town, I found myself heading over to Robert's property. The sun was already making its way into the horizon. His driveway was long and winding, leading to a gigantic house that looked like the surrounding forest was trying to swallow it. When I pulled up, it was already almost dark. A butler greeted me at the mansion, an old man carrying a silver tray covered in a soft cloth. He opened the car door and let me out, introducing himself only as Charles. "I will be taking your belongings now," he said. "If you don't make it out, they'll be destroyed at sunrise." He held out the tray. "Of course," I said, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. After placing them on the tray, he offered a smile. "Would you like a refreshment before heading in? Mr. Callahan's staff will accommodate you before heading into the forest. He truly appreciates you answering his ad." "I'm fine. Thank you. I guess I'd rather just get to it," I said, wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. "Of course. If you'll just follow me, it's right this way." He gestured for me to follow him. Charles escorted me through the house. The inside was furnished top to bottom with luxurious wooden furniture, bearskin rugs, chandeliers made of gold, and paintings from the Renaissance era. The estate was definitely worth a fortune. We passed by a trophy room filled wall to wall with mounts of animals from across the globe. They seemed to stare with their glass eyes, following us as we made our way through. Charles made no effort to engage in conversation, and neither did I. The other end of the mansion consisted of a large patio waiting for us. There was Robert, who seemed to be preparing for a little hunt. He was running a large combat knife over a whetstone slowly and methodically as we approached. Propped up next to him was a rifle, the bolt pulled back, several cartridges laid out on the glass table next to it, and the flare gun. "The time is approaching," said Charles, and Robert nodded. He wiped the blade off and sheathed it on his belt. I looked at his loadout on the table, starting to feel sick to my stomach. This was seriously happening. Now that I was here and seeing him fully prepared, I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. Robert stood and grabbed his rifle. He picked up each .308 cartridge and loaded them slowly, one at a time, until it was full. He racked the bolt forward, slung the rifle on his shoulder, and grabbed the flare gun. 15 minutes. Then flare, he said. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, twirling the flare gun on his finger. "No, not really," I said, making my way off the patio. I wasn't exactly sure what to say in a situation like this, so I figured it was best just to get going. "Excellent. I'll see you on the other side," he saluted me, and Charles gave me a nod. I turned and left the patio, making my way into the woods. Each step got heavier as I approached the trees, the darkness behind them getting eerier the closer I got. When I reached the tree line, I looked back at the mansion. Robert and Charles just watched expectantly. I swallowed and ducked in, feeling the full weight of my decision, perhaps a little too late. Once the mansion was no longer visible, I started jogging. I was mindful of my footsteps. A stray log or vine could trip me up. During my time as a park ranger, I spent dozens of hours hiking trails. I would survey the land weekly, picking up discarded things like trash and lost clothing. This landscape was much different, however. The ground was uneven, years of collecting leaves, buried and fallen limbs, and jagged rocks. I was wearing decent boots, but the terrain was unforgiving. One misplaced step, and I could roll or break an ankle. I wouldn't be able to rush too much, so I maintained a steady pace, hoping to put enough distance between us and maybe find a decent place to hide. With the sunset and no light source, I couldn't see very far in front of me. I tried not to think about how much time had passed. I just focused on pushing forward. The trees started to crowd, giant maples with lush branches blocking the moonlight. I ducked under them quickly. A twisted branch snagged my shirt, and I shook it loose. Birds screeched and roused from their perch, flapping away in a panic at my presence, their cries echoing into the night, sending a chill down my spine. There's nothing to be afraid of, I thought to myself. Not yet, at least. I came to a small clearing and took a second to catch my breath. I leaned on a tree, shaking clumps of mud and pine needles from my boots. The ground was wetter than I had anticipated. Off in the distance behind me, there was an echoing pop, and I looked to see the flare reaching toward the sky, a little orange ball of fire. I pushed off the tree and continued. I had to keep moving. I ran across the clearing, each step squished on the ground as I went on. My third stride, my boot stepped on something awkward and hard. By the time I heard the clicking sound, I knew it was already too late. The sudden force clamped down on both sides of my ankle. I could do nothing but cry in pain. I stumbled awkwardly to the ground, agony shooting through my leg as the wind was knocked out of me. I looked down at the bear trap, blood oozing from where the metal jaws were buried. I was frustrated at my foolishness. Of course, he had put traps in the woods. Why wouldn't he? I forced the jaws apart, the mechanism creaking, begging to bite down again. My hands shook, holding the slippery metal, and my leg was barely free. I let it snap shut. The sound of steel on steel clanked into the night, so loud it bounced off the trees. A second later, I heard an excited whooping noise. I'd heard him. He would be coming. I tried to see my ankle in the dark. There were nasty gashes on either side, but I didn't think it was broken. I got back up. It would hold weight. It was just hurting like hell. I didn't want to look back when I pushed forward, panic starting to set in, trying to regulate my breathing. I moved as quickly as I could, one strong step, one baby limp. I scanned the ground, looking for more traps. There had to be more, surely. Branches whipped my cheeks and pulled at my clothes. I tried to be more careful, but I just couldn't see them quick enough. My left foot squelched with every step, blood soaking through my sock into the laces. I pressed on, hurdling a large dead log. I had to find a spot to hide for a moment to catch my breath. My heart was racing. I was having trouble thinking rationally as I could with the situation. A wave of fear washed over me for the first time in a long time. I'd gotten what I wanted, a thrill to make me feel alive. But as I looked down at my mangled leg, I was starting to regret it. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Branches next to my ear exploded, specks of bark and dust hitting my face from the racing bullet. I threw myself to the ground and started crawling, dragging my injured ankle with me. I dragged myself to a large pine tree and sat behind it, trying to come up with a plan. The gun went off again, closer this time. The round punched into the tree, shaking loose needles that fell from above. I squinted in the dark, trying to see ahead. In front of me, the ground started to slope, and I could finally make out the sound of rushing water. It could be a creek or a small river. Keeping behind the large pine, I slowly stood, trying to stick to the shadows until I was ready. I pushed off and started to run for the slope, hearing the gunfire again. As soon as I was in view, a fierce pain ripped through my shoulder, and my arm went limp, but I wouldn't stop. I started down the hill. I could see the shimmering surface of the creek below, something bobbing in the water, rotted logs from the looks of it. I needed to get down there, get under the water, and use the logs as cover. I worked my way down the slope. The ground was wet, each step threatening to slide out from underneath me. I heard footsteps now, breaking sticks and brushing trees as they tried to catch up. Another gunshot. The bullet whizzed over my head and missed. I tried to go down further and crouched, but my feet were too unstable. I focused on the water, a little bit closer and closer, like it was my salvation. I was almost there. Behind me, I could hear the racking of the bolt-action rifle. I shot a panicked look behind me. I could barely see him working through the trees, 20 yards away. As I turned back to the creek, my good foot got caught on something. I fell forward, hit the ground hard, and started to roll painfully and awkwardly in the dark. I watched my descent in a swirl of moonlight and darkness, my elbows and knees colliding with the earth as I went. I came to a stop at the edge of the water, lying on my back, gasping for air. I barely moved, my vision spinning as I looked up at the sky. I could hear him coming down the hill slowly and carefully. He knew he had won. He was taking his time now. Exhausted and defeated, I looked at the creek. It wasn't logs I had seen floating. Bodies. Several of them, bloating and rotting in the clear glow of the moon. I looked around. The more I saw, men, women, children. Robert was there now, boots squishing as he looked down at me. A pair of black goggles were over his eyes, a wicked grin on his face. He unslung his rifle and let it fall to the ground, then pulled the goggles off his face and cast them aside like toys. Disappointing. Very disappointing. I thought with you being a park ranger and all, you'd make it further. But here we are, at the creek. They never make it past the creek. Robert cracked his knuckles and pulled the knife from his belt. He held the knife in both hands and brought it down, aiming for my heart. I put up my hands to fight him, but it only delayed the inevitable. He worked free from my grasp and elbowed me in the head. My vision blurred once more. My arms went slack as he buried the knife in my chest. My lung collapsed as the blade went in, and with a grunt, he pulled the blade down, separating my torso down the middle in a nasty gushing mess. Satisfied, he got up and left me there to die. I tried to talk, but it all came out as gurgled whispers. What was that? He mocked, and he knelt to hear me. With the last of my breath, I spoke my final 2 words, just loud enough for him to hear. Involuntary screams came next, loud and shrill, broken vocal cords shouting in a mixture of barking and screeching. With both hands, I pulled the large incision, yanking the flesh apart in a spray of blood and disintegrating organs. His reaction was the same as all others before him, a look of pure irrational fear. My thin, inky black limbs burst from the gaping wound in my torso. I was on him in an instant, slashing the knife away and digging my nails into his flesh. I ripped his shirt like paper and separated his chest just like he did to me, my piercing screeches ringing into the night until I burrowed so deep they could no longer be heard. He thrashed and oozed from every orifice as he made room for me, just as the cab driver did, and the park ranger before him. I ate and wriggled as he expired, worming and digging my tiny frame to each limb like a suit. When the fit was just right, I stood up and cracked my knuckles. I looked at my reflection in the water, running a hand over my new face to feel the fit. Better than the last one, for sure. I took my time going back to the estate, making sure my walk was just right and everything was in place. The hours passed as I settled in, feeling more and more at home as I worked the joints and muscles. At daybreak, I emerged from the tree line to find Charles on the patio waiting. He came to greet me immediately. "Sir, this one had you out all night. Was this one better than the others? Can I get you something to drink?" "Oh, much better than the last," I replied. "A bourbon, if you will." I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. "Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy?" It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position? Stand by, Billy, I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set up campsite. No explanation. No clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario, folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. Roger that, John, Billy replied. Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically. Will do. Tower 9 out, I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected. A pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. We walk from here. Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. "Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy?" Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. "Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status?" I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. "I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp," I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. "The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more." There was a pause before Billy spoke again. "What's your current location, John?" I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. "John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse." Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. "You may be right, Billy," I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. "I'll just head." I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. "Repeat your last, John." "I didn't get that." "Stand by." "Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. "Hello?" I called out, turning in a circle. "I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here?" Nothing, just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. "Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right?" "Nothing to be concerned about," Billy answered almost immediately. "Roger that, John. Head back home." I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. "I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first." "I wouldn't screw around out there, John," Billy replied, an edge to his voice. "Better head back now so you can beat the storm." His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. Acknowledged, I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. But I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" she asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt." Hear me moving around in there? I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. "I'm with the Forest Service." It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. "What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." He seemed to be getting closer, at least if I could guide them to my voice. Maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" repeated the male voice, now even closer. "Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand." Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. At least it made me feel a little bit better until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. "Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily, driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle, no radio, no GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that." He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. "You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing. Hell of a storm." I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, "What an understatement." Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. "Did you find the campers at least?" I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. "No," I said softly. "I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave." I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor, and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. "You went into the cave?" he said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. "Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when." I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. "Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers. I think it followed me out." Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. "Utami," he muttered. "That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami." He nodded. "False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator?" "It means bad," he continued. No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten. It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. I need to get back to my tower and make a call now. I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. Why not use mine? Billy shook his head. Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late. I started to stand. I'll go with you, I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded. His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. Billy, I can go with you. I can help. I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders, he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large. A little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the Yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop, both intrepid adventurers, made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease, keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp LeClaire, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight, a barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it. But the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee Tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July, 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. Not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else, fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green, was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update. I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kuatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea. My Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower, and I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As Pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal. at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked, something that didn't belong in the light of day, something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed, it meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding for my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. "Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved?" Another silence, and then he said, "I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order." I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the Fire Watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, "Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me." I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. "Damn it, John. I told you to leave." Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. "Billy?" I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. "How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before." "I have always admired and respected you," I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, "Come on up." I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. "Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help." He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. "Sounded just like you, John." I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. "Almost there, John," he continued. "Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it." I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. "Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later." He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline's skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, instead, there were 2 bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw 2 membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. "Killed a bear." I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for. I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4. And when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open. Way back in 2015, I first saw that photo, the one that changed my life. There she was, a young woman sitting on a bed with the most breathtaking view of pine-dotted mountains behind her. I remember thinking, if that's her home, what do I have to do to live in that kind of coniferous paradise? I did some research and found out that the woman wasn't living there permanently. She was a fire lookout. She stayed up there for months at a time and got paid for it. From that moment, I was obsessed. Living the life of a fire lookout for a summer seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. I thought it would be easy to get into, but I was wrong on both counts. When I first applied in 2015, I was way underqualified and got rejected within days. That stung, but it also ignited a fire in me. I did volunteer work, built up my resume with stints at community gardens, and even spent some time at the National Arboretum. By the time 2016 rolled around, I thought I had a fighting chance. But after weeks of hoping and praying, I got another rejection. This one hurt twice as much. I'd put in the work, but it still wasn't enough. It took 2 more years of grinding, applying, and getting rejected. By the time I applied for the 2017 season, just before the 2016 holidays, I was so jaded that I made alternative plans for the summer. That way, the rejection would be like water off a duck's back. And then, the only time I actually planned not to be accepted was the year I finally was. I remember opening the email with shaking hands. When I read the words, "Congratulations, you've been assigned to Gold Mountain Lookout," I felt a mix of disbelief and elation. I'd waited 4 years for this, and it was finally happening. Gold Mountain, the tallest live-in tower in Washington State, would be my home for the next 3 months. I caught a red-eye from Portland to Spokane, landed in the early morning, and drove 170 miles out to Gold Mountain with my truck rental. The place was surprisingly easy to locate, with its own access road, Gold Mountain Lookout Drive. When I arrived mid-morning, a friendly forest ranger met me. We went over a few final details, and he handed me the keys. His big, warm smile and the way he asked if I had any second thoughts made me laugh. I was too excited to back out now. Once he left, I was alone. The isolation was both thrilling and daunting. I danced a little jig as I went to retrieve my stuff, feeling on top of the world. The only downsides were having to use a nearby creek to wash myself and walking down to the bottom of the tower to use the chemical toilet. But the pros outweighed the cons by a mile. For the first few days, everything was perfect. I loved the solitude, the peace, and the spectacular views. It was everything I dreamed of, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Be careful what you wish for. The nights were the hardest. I didn't scare easily, but the noises in the woods at night were unnerving. The wind howled around the tower, making it creak like an old ship. I told myself it was just the wind, but the fear of something more sinister lingered. Every creak and groan felt like a footstep. Every rustle of leaves, like a whisper. One night, as I lay in bed with my heart racing, I realized that this dream of mine wasn't going to be all about peace and solitude. There was something out there, something watching, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The isolation grew on me faster than I expected. Each day was a new adventure, and I quickly fell into a routine. Wake up, check for fires, maintain the equipment, log the weather, and enjoy the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched out before me. It was everything I'd imagined and more. But there was always that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. The creek was my lifeline for washing up, and it was about 100 meters from the lookout tower. The first few times, I was apprehensive, constantly looking over my shoulder. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me. But I convinced myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I'd come here for solitude, after all, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. Then one day, as I made my way down to the creek, I saw him, a man crouched on the opposite side, dressed like a typical hiker but built like a linebacker. He had dark hair and glasses that gave him a nerdy look, but there was something off about him. My first instinct was to turn back. I forced myself to keep going. After all, he might just be another hiker passing through. "Hey there! Nice day for a hike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I approached the creek. He looked up, startled, and then stood up slowly. "Yeah, it is," he replied, but his eyes lingered on me longer than I liked. I stepped into the water, pretending to wash my hands, all the while keeping an eye on him. He seemed curious, asking what I was doing out here all alone. "I'm a fire lookout," I explained, trying to sound casual. "I stay up in the tower and monitor for fires." "All by yourself?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Yes, but I have a radio and bear mace," I said, holding up the canister as if to prove a point. "I'm perfectly safe." He didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and eventually walked away. I watched him go, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. There was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. I finished washing up quickly and hurried back to the tower. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. My nights became more restless, each creak of the tower and howl of the wind making it harder to sleep. Then, a week later, I saw him again. I was down at the creek, and there he was, sitting on a rock as if waiting for me. My heart sank. This time, his presence wasn't a coincidence. He was there for me. "Hello again," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping I'd run into you." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I just think it's dangerous for someone to be out here all alone," he replied, standing up and taking a step toward me. "You should have someone to watch your back." "I don't need anyone to watch my back," I said, stepping away from him. "I'm fine on my own." His smile faded, replaced by a look of frustration. "You're not safe out here, Jessica. Anything could happen." The way he said my name sent chills down my spine. I backed away, gripping my bear mace tightly. "Stay away from me," I warned. He didn't listen. Instead, he took another step toward me, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm just trying to help." I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran back to the tower, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the steps, I glanced back and saw him watching me, his expression unreadable. Back in the safety of the tower, I locked the door and sank to the floor, my hands shaking. The dream of solitude and peace had turned into a nightmare. I wasn't alone out here, and I wasn't safe. A week passed after that second encounter, but I never felt at ease. My once peaceful sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every shadow and rustle outside was a potential threat. I tried to focus on my duties, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon for signs of fire, but my mind kept drifting back to Tony. His words haunted me. "You're not safe out here, Jessica." It was late one night when it happened. The crickets had been singing their usual chorus, and I was beginning to drift off when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A footstep on the steel stairs below. My eyes flew open, and my heart pounded in my chest. I lay there listening, hoping it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, the distinct clink of a boot on metal. Someone was climbing the stairs. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, pulling on my boots and grabbing the bear mace and taser. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself. "I know someone's out there," I called out, my voice trembling but loud. "I've got a gun, and I'm about to call the Rangers." There was a moment of silence. Then I heard his voice. "You're not safe out here, Jessica." That same flat, scolding tone. It was Tony. Fear surged through me. But I forced myself to stay calm. "If you try to come in here, I'll push you off the tower," I shouted. "Get out of here now!" His footsteps continued, slowly, methodically. He was getting closer. Through the gaps in the floor, I could see his shadow moving up the stairs. My hands shook, but I held the bear mace ready, my thumb on the trigger. Then, Tony's face appeared at the window, illuminated by the faint moonlight. His twisted expression of anger and determination sent a fresh wave of terror through me. He didn't say anything this time. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and cold. Then he reached for the door handle. "Don't you dare!" I screamed, and without hesitation I sprayed the bear mace directly at his face. He recoiled, howling in pain, but he didn't back down. Instead, he lunged forward, trying to push his way into the cabin. I dodged his grasp, my heart racing. He was strong, and I knew I couldn't let him get his hands on me. I grabbed the taser and jabbed it into his side. He screamed, a horrible guttural sound, and fell back against the wall. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Leave me alone." Tony staggered, trying to regain his balance. I hit him with the taser again, and he collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. For a moment, I thought he might pass out, but he managed to drag himself toward the stairs. I followed him, my heart still pounding. I gave him one last blast of bear mace as he descended, making sure he wouldn't turn back. He stumbled down the steps, cursing and groaning, until he disappeared into the darkness below. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the radio. I called the Rangers, my voice trembling as I reported the attack. By the time they arrived, Tony was long gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. The Rangers were sympathetic, but their reassurances did little to calm my nerves. The police were called, and they questioned me extensively. But without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Tony had vanished into the night, leaving me with nothing but fear and the gnawing dread that he might come back. The once serene and beautiful lookout tower now felt like a fortress under siege, and I was its lone defender, always waiting, always watching, never truly at peace. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Every noise, every movement in the forest below set my nerves on edge. I barely slept. The cricket song, which once lulled me to sleep, now kept me awake. Each chirp felt like a countdown to another terrifying encounter with Tony. I kept the bear mace and taser within arm's reach, constantly reminding myself of their presence, a flimsy barrier against the relentless dread. One night, as I sat by the window, scanning the dark tree line, I saw a shadow move. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. The Rangers were kind, but there was only so much they could do. They patrolled the area more frequently and reassured me that Tony had likely moved on. But their words were hollow. I knew better. Tony wasn't just a passerby. He was a predator, and I was his prey. I kept my radio close, checking in with the Rangers more often than necessary. They didn't mind. They understood my fear. Each time I pressed the button and heard their voices, a small measure of calm washed over me. But it never lasted long. One particularly cold and windy night, I was jolted awake by a sound I had come to dread, the creak of the stairs. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The wind howled around the tower, making it difficult to discern specific noises. I strained my ears, hoping, praying that it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate footstep on the metal stairs. I grabbed the bear mace and taser, my hands trembling. This time, I didn't call out. I waited. My breath was shallow. My pulse raced. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could see a shadow moving up the stairs. As the shadow reached the top, I shone my flashlight directly at it, illuminating Tony's twisted, furious face. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression one of pure rage. "You're not safe out here, Jessica," he hissed, echoing his previous threat. Before he could take another step, I sprayed the bear mace directly into his face. He screamed, a guttural, animalistic sound, and stumbled back. I didn't wait for him to recover. I jabbed the taser into his side, sending volts of electricity through his body. He convulsed, collapsing onto the stairs. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear and anger. Get out and never come back. Tony managed to crawl down the stairs, his screams of pain echoing through the night. I watched him go, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. When he was finally out of sight, I ran back into the cabin and locked the door. The dream I had once cherished was now a ghost, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. I pulled into the campground just before sunset, expecting the usual, a few quiet families roasting marshmallows, maybe a couple of seasoned hikers turning in early. Instead, I was greeted by the clamor of loud music echoing off the tree line. The source? A cluster of tents circled around a blazing fire where a group of frat boys hollered and laughed like they had the whole place to themselves. Every so often, other campers peeked out of their tents, uneasy and clearly wishing guys would tone it down. I couldn't blame them. Noise doesn't just shatter the calm of a campsite, it draws attention from things best left undisturbed. Out here, folks whisper about the ghost cats, those local mountain lions known to slip into camps without warning. I'd seen enough tracks in eerily close proximity to sleeping bags to know these stories were more than just rumors. I parked my rig a little ways off and walked over, picking my path carefully around scattered coolers and folding chairs. As I got close, the frat boys paused their banter, giving me that half-attentive look. They were mostly older teens or early 20-somethings, still buzzing with alcohol and late-night bravado. Evening, I started, trying to keep it friendly but firm. I'm the ranger on duty. Got some other campers worried you're attracting unwanted attention. I motioned toward the looming tree line. These woods have a reputation, and it's not for the best sing-alongs. They laughed it off at first, so I leaned in, lowering my voice. I described how mountain lions sometimes stalk the perimeter of noisy camps, how you won't spot them until they're practically brushing against your tent walls. I explained how we call them ghost cats because of their uncanny silence, the way they seem to appear out of nowhere. They sobered up a bit. A couple exchanged uncertain glances, but one just shrugged, muttering that they'd keep it down. I issued a final warning anyway. Stay quiet, don't wander off, and if you hear anything odd outside in the dark, make no sound. I only hoped they'd actually listen. Once I'd done all I could, I headed back to the station. My buddy Jim was there, flipping through some old wildlife photos. He raised an eyebrow when I told him about the frat boys. Let me guess, blasting music, ignoring every rule we've got, right? He said, clearly unimpressed. Bingo, I replied. And they're not taking the mountain lion threat seriously. He let out a quiet laugh that contained zero humor. We both knew this was more than a minor annoyance. If something did happen, we'd be the ones hauling them out, or dealing with an injured cat that got too comfortable around humans. That's when we started talking about a plan. Not to harm anyone, obviously, but to rattle them enough that they'd finally grasp the gravity of a place like this. Jim reminded me about the old lion pelt in our interpretive center. Used it once or twice for educational tours, though it always gave me the creeps. Its glass eyes caught the light in this unnerving way, like it was still alive. We also had night vision goggles stashed away, thanks to a budget splurge before the new fiscal year. Perfect for sneaking around in the dark, unseen by unsuspecting campers. Over the next half hour, we pieced together a strategy, fake prints, hidden growls, and a well-timed appearance of a lion silhouette. It might just be the jolt they needed to pack up, or at the very least, dial down the party volume. Grabbing the pelt from a dusty storage closet, I noticed the faint, musty smell of fur mixed with something almost medicinal. I ran my hand over the stiff mane, shivering at how realistic it still felt. Next, we tested the night vision goggles. Even in the dim station lights, they turned everything into an eerie green that made my pulse spike. By the time we had our gear ready, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The woods outside transformed into a dark maze. I had this sense that the frat boys, oblivious in their tents, were about to discover that being out here isn't just a carefree getaway. If they refused to respect the campground's unspoken rules, well, We'd give them a night they wouldn't forget. Jim killed the overhead lights as we locked up. We checked our plan one last time, and I took a breath, settling my nerves. We were about to sneak into that campsite, loaded with props and a fair share of wild imagination. In the back of my mind, I thought about the actual ghost cats prowling these hills. I hoped we wouldn't run into a real one while pulling our prank. It's one thing to frighten a few campers. It's another to come face to face with the genuine article. Still, I felt this rush of adrenaline as we set off into the darkness. Maybe it was the satisfaction of delivering a wake-up call. Or maybe it was just that strange, hushed energy you feel whenever you realize you're not at the top of the food chain out here. Either way, there was no turning back. We had our plan, and we were committed to seeing it through. The night was only getting darker, and the silent woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting for whatever came next. I hunched down in the cramped front seat of our Jeep, double-checking that the lion pelt was still tucked out of sight. Outside, moonlight drenched the forest in faint silver, and every rustle of wind through the branches made me brace for actual movement. I couldn't help scanning the dark spaces between the trees, searching for any flicker of eyes that might belong to the real thing. My coworker Jim was fidgeting in the passenger seat, adjusting the small PA system we'd use for the recorded roars. "Ready?" he asked, voice low. "As I'll ever be," I replied, half hoping those frat kids were already asleep and half itching to put our plan into action. Either way, we needed to move quickly. The night sky was starless, and visibility would only get worse. I eased the Jeep toward their campsite, headlights off to keep our approach silent. Stopping a good distance away, we slipped out and quietly shut the doors. The path under our boots was damp from an earlier drizzle, which made our footfalls softer, but also gave the soil a perfect texture for stamping fake tracks. One by one, we planted oversized paw prints in the mud, making sure to press deeply near the tents. Every so often, we paused to listen, worried someone inside might stir and peek outside. But all we heard was the faint crackle of a dying fire. Next, Jim propped the lion pelt onto two sturdy sticks we duct-taped together. Seen straight on, it was eerily convincing. Massive head, snarling mouth, and the kind of glassy eyes that appeared to stare into your soul. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting an actual animal to emerge, drawn by the uncanny shape. With the pelt set up, we turned to the other part of our plan. The roars. We'd preloaded the PA system with a series of snarls and growls from real mountain lion recordings. Jim started them at a low volume from across the clearing. The first noise rumbled through the darkness like a threat, and I could almost sense the campers tensing in their tents. A second roar followed, echoing off the surrounding trees, making it sound as if multiple predators were encircling the area. I slipped back into the Jeep and carefully flicked on the headlights, aiming them so they backlit the pelt. From the angle of the beam, it looked like a living, breathing cat pacing along the outskirts of the camp. Jim shouted from behind a bush, "Stay in your tents." His voice shook with just enough panic to convince anyone he was facing a genuine attack. "She's moving around us," he hollered, layering more drama into the moment. Then he bellowed, "There's another one." The reaction inside those tents was instant. Muffled cries, frantic rustling, the scrape of tent zippers being yanked shut. I killed the lights in one sudden click. Darkness swallowed the campsite. Jim dropped the sticks, and we ditched the lion pelt. In under a minute, we tore back to the Jeep, adrenaline hammering through every vein. As I started the engine and sped off, I thought I detected one final roar playing through the PA system, echoing behind us like a last warning. When dawn finally broke, the camp's radio chatter indicated that nobody had poked their head out until well into the morning. From our station windows, we could imagine their pale faces and wide eyes discovering the huge paw prints scattered around, some alarmingly close to their tent doors. We heard they packed up not long after, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders at the looming forest. No doubt, they were rattled to the core. Jim and I swapped glances. both relieved to hear they were safe, but also satisfied we'd given them something to think about. We'd wanted them to respect these woods, or at least remember that nature doesn't tolerate fools. From what we heard later, they told everyone about the mountain lion attack they'd barely survived. Maybe next time, they'd remember that out here. Silence can be the difference between a peaceful night and something far more dangerous. My name is Mara Caldwell, and I'm 28 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art, and frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead, it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything: your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described: quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods, it was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics, packed up my supplies, and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right. The lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled trees overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees. A name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste. But what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving, a sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming, but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light and my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in, like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure, waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again. This time, closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist. Her presence lifted, like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe in a way, so have I. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last, but something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70, heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive. He needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister. Bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me, just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. No, not tapping. Scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, and I jumped in my seat. Static. Then, through the fuzz, I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again, then came the knocking, loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out, one voice I knew, Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar. Faces I'd seen on the road before. Long-dead truckers, friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her. Carol, standing in the middle of the road, her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it skidded across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again. Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even. But as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need, high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. "Focus," I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. Two, no, three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference. Some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees-y? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across. And they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest. Close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes, faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints, dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal and the frost melted away, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more. Something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out.